So, welcome to the Law in Sport podcast with me, Sean Cottrell, the founder and CEO of Law in Sport. Our guest today is Dr J Simon Rofe, who is a reader in Diplomatic and International Studies at the Centre of International Studies and Diplomacy, the CISD. I'm delighted to have Simon on because we've been speaking now for a good couple of years. To start off with, if you could give a bit of a flavour and a description of what sports diplomacy is, and then we can come into why it's relevant for sports law, and then talk about recent developments as well. But our ongoing discussion around why diplomacy is such an important element to sport globally.
In essence, sport diplomacy, what it means, it's the explanatory framework and overlay to the network of evolving networks within the realms of both sport and diplomacy. It offers under the premise of three core characteristics of diplomacy: representation, negotiation, and communication. A conceptual understanding of sport that provides the sort of navigation skills for practitioners to connect with and learn from different parts of the sport diplomacy ecosystem, and helps provide critical reflection for policymakers and practitioners and scholars and lawyers to enhance their practice in these overlapping and conjoined spaces. In such, it's really about helping us in the world of sports law or diplomacy understand other people's perspectives, and sport is a great vector for that, and I think in these current climes will be an increasingly important one. I have to say, I am heartened by the way that sport is being conceived of and reconceived. There are challenges and there are missteps along the way, but I think we can all be a bit more forgiving of some of the difficulties that individuals find themselves in, and reconciling those different positions moving forward. The processes and the forces at work that will lead to the post-COVID environment, the realignment, those forces of realignment are something that are going to be very important for all of us to understand. And some of it will coalesce around things that are quite familiar, but some of it will coalesce around activities, behaviors, practices that are really quite different from what's gone before. The important point is to be to think about how we engage with a variety of stakeholders that are going to be part of that, and make sure we don't exclude those who are maybe considered to be extraneous previously, but now have a far greater role. And I'm thinking here particularly about sort of the social and local parts of sport, which have been overlooked to a point in the commercial and the transnational. I'm sure we could talk about that a little more.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Thanks for that introduction. And for those that still have the view maybe that why does sport diplomacy matter, or here we go, there's someone else coining a phrase to be banded around the sports sector, and particularly in academia, sometimes that can be unhelpful when there's these phrases. When we went for a lovely lunch a few months back, we talked about this, and the way you said it to me was that, as you sort of articulated then, that it's just really just a helpful framework in which people can just really get to grips with and have a better understanding of other people's position. And I found it particularly useful. So I came into sports law and sports sector in particular, coming from a sports science background initially, then a legal background, and thinking, right, okay, if I understand the law, then we can understand the structures of good governance and everything in sport and all the business associated to it. Then I understood you need the politics, the economics, and now I understand that you need the politics. And seeing and having been involved with some of the workshops you've run and others, how that dialogue is put together, the stakeholders that are brought together, is also important. I've seen some very impressive outcomes from some of the things that I've had a privilege to be involved with. Given that there's every day at the moment having conversations from a legal perspective now about insolvency and reconstruction, people worried about redundancies, not only just from a sports perspective, but the associated industries around it. It's quite worrying times in that regard for everyone, I think. How do you see, or what advice would you give, given the experience that you have, if you are a government or if you're a governing body of sport at this moment in time, how would you advise people, or maybe you're a football club, you know, trying to go, or I said a local sports organization, how would you recommend that people approach the dialogue that they're having?
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, and I think it almost, in some senses, given the nature of our conversations, you're already thinking about those different stakeholders and the different dialogues. I think we need to recognise that not everyone's in that position, and that sometimes people don't know who to call in this sort of Ghostbusters version of management. Is who's on the end of the phone, who are you going to call? Yeah. And I think actually taking a moment at this point in time, thinking about who your stakeholders are. Now, for a professional football club, for example, headline sponsors are things that make their business tick over. But you're in a position to think about what is the nature of your business. Putting 11 athletes out on a Saturday afternoon or Sunday evening or whenever it may be to play a football match creates a huge amount of commerce. But the other things that your sports organization, your elite football club does, the thousands of people who are employed on a match day who now in that situation aren't employed, the lots of development activity, all of the scouting networks that people, maybe one of a number of jobs, but there's a considerable societal impact on your local environment. Now there's a transnational environment too, because if you're a big football club like Manchester United, then you've considered and cultivated and spent millions of pounds and dollars and euros on overseas markets, and they are no less important in some regards, but the connections that you've made, the links that bring you together are differentiated. Now the situation, that much of this response has been on a national basis. Well, national governments have a role to play. No scholar of diplomacy is ever going to deny that. But there are other facets to their, who else is part of this? The IOC in recent days have been, particularly, challenged by the notion of pushing back the Olympics from Tokyo in 2020 to 2021. We saw the decision 10 days ago or so with UEFA putting Euro 2020 back to Euro 2021. The knock-on effects of this are not just legal in terms of contracts that were signed to deliver something with a specific date on, but the transactions of diplomacy that mean that, for example, with the Euros, that now bumps up against the Women's European Championships, which to be hosted in the United Kingdom, in England, forgive me, in 2021. Now, projects and work had already been undertaken in that regard. There's, a good degree of opportunity here, and I think this is really what we should perhaps focus on. So those forces of realignment, is it possible to run a tournament, in effect, on a more limited geographic scale? Is it possible to have tournaments which have a greater degree of sustainability? I think that's part of a conversation that people were already willing to have and were approaching, but perhaps this provides an impetus, COVID-19, to think about how we are really going to look at sustainable, not just sport mega events, but sustainable sport, people not traveling up and down the country, in their hundreds of thousands to visit, a sporting fixture, but to be able to engage in that in a different and, equally rewarding, but, fundamentally different way. And I think some of those. So
the thing I was going to ask is that in a sort of utopian world where everyone's being kind and generous, and at this moment in time, I think we're in a period where people are being very, some people are being very sympathetic towards, and I think particularly football clubs, as far as I'm seeing, and other sports organisations globally, have been very conscious of putting their resources to help and assist, whether it's fundraising, whether it's getting help, again, asking staff to help out, volunteers to help out, helping just domestically the NHS, Chelsea obviously with their using their hotel for NHS staff, I know other clubs have been doing some fantastic stuff. Various have made pledges to various community groups, etc. That's fantastic, and I applaud them for doing it. I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. So at a time where they're all under pressure, and obviously football clubs have generally got greater ability, particularly the big ones, I should say. The Premier League clubs have got the ability to deal with these difficult, will be economic times, and potentially difficult economic times. Whereas some of the smaller clubs don't really have that level of bandwidth, let's say, or capital to be able to cope. And likewise in rugby, we've seen, what's going on. The RFU are doing some great work to help their members out. So when the dust settles, let's say, and hopefully this passes in a few months, it seems like it's going to be much longer, but God willing, it will pass over as quickly as possible with as least amount of casualties as possible. How do these conversations restart, and what advice would you give to be the most effective to get the outcome that you want? But let's start off domestically for the time being, and then let's move to the issue of the Tokyo Games, where I think when you're dealing with a culture like the Japanese culture, and they say either Swiss culture or British culture or European culture, they are different, and therefore how they approach diplomacy and negotiation is vastly different. So maybe you could enlighten us, starting off with, in the UK, what sort of top tips would you give to people here, or in fact any other domestic place? What are the sort of, if you have a top 10 tips of diplomacy, how would you approach it? What's the strategy you would deploy?
Well, just a small question then, Sean. I think
always very narrow questions.
yeah. I think the thing that strikes me most is that the processes that are in place that will lead to the realignment and the effectively the restarting, things that we like to see as familiar, fixture lists, whatever they, for my son's under 8s football team, or for major international competition. I think the forces that are there, they're still have been there for millennia. Representation, communication, and negotiation are things that, whether you are an official ambassador on behalf of a nation state, or any representative of a local football club or a national one, you are having these conversations anyway. You're part of that dialogue, whether you've recognized it in yourself or others have recognized it in you. I don't think you could underestimate the the sort of ambassadorial qualities that you're going to be exhibiting. So if that's your providing leadership as a under 8s coach on a Saturday morning, if that's providing support to a communication network, if that's using your YouTube channel to share information, as a scholar, if that's teaching students and sending them out, as it were, into the world, we all have these opportunities to represent ourselves, our local community, the multiple different identities we have, and they, to me, are things that will become even more important. And I think the opportunities.
Sorry, am I wrong in this? Sorry to interrupt you.
Is there
a better way though? So I agree with you on those points entirely, and I think whether or not people acknowledge it or not, obviously you're right that you're representing something or someone or a group, and everyone can have an impact. However, there is going to be a better way, and we've seen it. Say, for example, in a legal context, we see, say, for example, collective bargaining, other negotiations that are done very well and very effectively, and some others that are done not very well, right? And there's certain people who are known for rubbing people up the wrong way, and there's other people who are known for being incredibly effective in terms of getting the outcomes they want. So in that regard, what would say the best thing to do, and what are the not so good things to do? The things that you might take for granted because you've been doing this for such a long time, but if you were going to say to someone, right, you're going to be sitting against someone who you may perceive as adversarial in this situation, like trying to fight for funding, fight for support, deal with your employees, what are the best approaches, would you say?
I think being prepared to listen, even in adversarial circumstances, even when there's competition, and again, I'm going to hark back to some of the long-held tropes of diplomacy. Even when you're, you still have to talk to your enemies, and that's how problems and issues are resolved ultimately. There is a good degree of opportunity. I think the best, being prepared in your position, understanding different points of negotiation, understanding where you are prepared to, compromise to a point. These are all, in some senses, standard practices and things that colleagues would be familiar with. But I think
I don't think they would. Sorry, just to interrupt you, Simon. Again, I don't mean to do this. I think that for our audience and our listeners, I think some will be really familiar with it. I think others will not be, because
okay,
we have a global membership. Only 25% comes from the UK, and so just if you can just elaborate on that a little bit more, because again, for the more senior people who are listening, more experienced people, they'll go, oh yeah, this is pretty bog standard. In my experience in the sports sector, there is a bunch of people who work in the sector who are incredibly passionate about what they do, incredibly driven, but there's a varying degrees of experience. And so I think if you could elaborate on it, it'd be really helpful.
So I think in certain circumstances, the difficulties that you face in negotiating, will always be there. But what one should do is think about the points of compromise that this situation has thrown up, the solidarity that different circumstances will offer in the future. And by that, I mean, maybe there's an alliance now between a football club and a rugby club that would never have happened before, because, they were using the same supply network. They were using the same sort of security staff. They were, going from one event to the next, depending upon, sort of the fixture list. Is there a way to use that kind of resource more efficiently and more sensibly, more sustainably? Can you offer, the training that's done for, security staff or gate staff or catering staff at the football club to the same people at the cricket club or the rugby club? Can you do that in a tiered way, so that it's not just the elite rugby club and the elite football club, but the local football club? How many of the local football teams within a 5-mile radius of Old Trafford have ever had a training session, even at the old Manchester United training facilities? Some of this is about making good use of the resources we have, and it's not to wish to impose on Manchester United or any other particular club, but it's just to say that actually utilising some of those resources and thinking about the way that in a post-COVID environment, we might not be able to, revert back to having, 25 football pitches next to each other, all being played on at the same time, the car parking nightmare that ensues. But we've been into those circumstances. So I think thinking about that on a sort of practical level, and I'd really emphasize from the whole sort of sport diplomacy point of view, it's about the practice. It's about making those links that you wouldn't have done otherwise, having conversations you wouldn't have done otherwise, and therefore picking up and being aware of that. It's so easy to be siloed in our thinking, both in academia and scholarship. Absolutely, and in law, so you're not making the connections. How many other lawyers do I know than you, Sean, in a fashion? Not that many. But I think this is an example of where sport particularly can make a connection. So people who actually are, the PE teacher community, invested in the teaching community within schools. Well, that's one set of environments. Who do we know is the, head of sport at your local county council? Who is that? How does that
So a piece of advice then would be is one, obviously it sounds to me, think out of the box, think out the traditional norm, think about how people, even at this difficult time, going forward, how they can be more resourceful. But secondly, start some conversations with people who they otherwise wouldn't have the opportunity.
Your network. Reappraise your network. Who are the stakeholders? 5 people who you wouldn't have spoken to before this. Make the effort to speak to them. Both the individual and the.
I think that's I was going to say, I think that's good practice anyway, and I think it's really been really interesting, because I've been having some great conversations with people, and normally I love to see people in person, but obviously because of the restrictions we can't. It's been fantastic to catch up with a whole bunch of different people, right? Because you just got a little bit more time because you're not commuting here, there, and everywhere.
And I think that's a really important just be prepared to have those conversations you wouldn't have normally, but also think about who, what are the other networks you're part of. So, much of the, heartening solidarity local communities that we're part, that are groups that have come up, whether that's delivering food to your, elderly neighbor or just checking in on people, how else can they be part of that conversation? How are those networks, maybe those people were part of, a football club or a cricket club, or had some contribution of yesteryear. Maybe they served in the armed forces and were part of the sports, environment. And that the armed forces is a good example. Sport has always been an important part of particularly British forces experiences. And it was used for particular purposes, of course. But there are other parts of that, the community and social dimension, and the local. Bringing the army in many regards a good example of this. You've got people from all over the country. Yes, there are geographic concentrations, obviously, but playing in the same team, literally, and those sporting networks filtering out of their military uniforms into other demonstrably sporting environments. So I think that there's always someone a conversation to be had in that regard. And so in that sense, on a very local level, that's diplomacy. Maybe that's within your village, your street, your town, but these things extrapolate both sort of upwards and outwards. And so the idea of where else those things are replicable, what are the other parts of the conversation elsewhere, both nationally and then internationally, and can be very far afield. You don't have to be doing great elite sport to be having a connection with a club halfway around the world. So I think it's important to get them to be part of that sort of thinking, and that's one dimension of sport diplomacy. Obviously within its more formal status, you've got states and international sporting federations, national governing bodies who have particular interests, but about making those connections, I think that they wouldn't have done normally. And that's really something that's important to think about.
Particularly given that sport has this social license,
it does.
And if it has this social license, then what better way to validate the fact that you've been giving it, essentially, by actually contributing more and thinking differently, and really ensuring that's in your DNA. I think, as you were saying at the start of the podcast, from moving on from an international perspective with the Tokyo Games, how do you think that, what would be your commentary on how this has all played out? Because as with most organizations, most businesses, there's this almost standoff in terms of people were not wanting to pull the trigger as such, in terms of being the first person to make the move for a whole bunch of different reasons. How did you see the games being postponed? How did you see that all manifest itself from a diplomatic perspective?
Well, I don't think we should underestimate the diplomacy at work here. The IOC is a case study of diplomatic activity, and it has been throughout its modern existence. I think you've got to recognise the variety of different stakeholders, and that's not just the executive, IOC members, but all of the different commercial organisations that have strong sway, but also what sport, there's a strong element within the IOC of sport making a contribution to society, and postponing the centerpiece, the Summer Olympic Games, is not something that would ever be done lightly. And it's not to say that other sports organisations, again, whether it's UEFA or your local sports team, school teams, have been take anything less likely, but the IOC really have a challenge in being able to coordinate their decision making in that regard. I'd almost give them some credit in the sense that it's almost because it's a federalized organization to a point. Contrast that with FIFA's previous existence under Blatter. It's not that Thomas Bach woke up one morning and decided to change his mind. It's that he had to go through a negotiated process within those IOC members to arrive at that conclusion. I don't think you would have found very much, as it were, outright opposition, but there would have been a number of considerations at play. What does this say about the IOC moving forward? What does it say about any sporting organisation? But the IOC particularly, given it has such an important global governance role, both it's moral, it's ethical, it has a huge amount of influence and sway on those national Olympic committees, and then those national Olympic committees in influencing sports, even ones that don't feature in the Olympic Games. But nonetheless, there is an important leadership quality. There has been criticism that it took too long to make the decision. I think the sort of moral contract, rather than perhaps the legal contract between the IOC and the host nation, is something that will be could be reappraised. The Japanese leadership, the Prime Minister Abe, has made a great degree of investment, not just in
huge investment
monetary terms, but in terms of what Japan, what these Olympic Games are going to mean for Japan, particularly in the post Fukushima, post tsunami environment. I think they've done a pretty good job up to this point of being sensitive to the challenges of rebuilding a nation at the point at which the economic situation has been temperamental at best. I think they've therefore, what does it say about the national identity of Japan to have accepted being in a position where they weren't able to deliver something that they'd pledged to deliver? And I don't think you should underestimate that as a consideration. It's not going to be able to be trumped, as it were, by the gravity of COVID-19, but to recognise that it's more than something that's it poses a different set of challenges. I think if you're hosting the Olympic Games, the Summer Olympic Games,
I feel deeply sorry for them, as I do for the athletes, everyone involved, to be honest with you, just because the Olympics and Paralympics are expensive events to run at the best of times, right? And it's questionable whether or not nation states get their return on investment, particularly in the short term, let alone the long term. And then given this situation, I just think it's an incredibly difficult time for them. In terms of how diplomacy fits with law, since our conversations happened because of a mutual friend, Takea, Canterbury Christchurch, and yourself were hosting an event on sport for development and the UN Sustainability Development Goals, and I was invited to attend, and I hadn't really given it much thought before that. And then we started a dialogue because I felt that, and my research proved the fact that in the sports law environment, the UN Sustainability Development Goals wasn't really widely discussed. And you were talking about your groups and networks. I suddenly realised then the network that I had was very much on the too heavily weighted to a certain degree on the legal community. I wasn't speaking to some of the people in the sport for development or development for sport type roles. Obviously, then we started a discussion, and hence this podcast. And then you started to get more interested in the legal aspects. How, and given that you've got this, I think you're a part of the project with Richard Parish and from the European Commission on sports diplomacy, the Erasmus, is it Erasmus funded?
Yeah, Erasmus project,
EU Sport. And so maybe you can talk about that, and then talk about how your perceptions maybe changed of lawyers, or maybe it hasn't.
Well, the good news is I didn't have a lot of reason to have any connection with lawyers, so I haven't had to reconstruct my preconceptions to any great extent. I think it's an interesting starting place. One of the most rewarding features of the sort of building out this field of sport diplomacy has been to recognise that there are a number of other realms that need to be part of the conversation that help frame the discussion. So the legal dimension is one, and I give good credit to you here, Sean, largely through my knowing about your work, is something that provides a some points of connection, but also some buttressing, the parameters of what sport diplomacy entails, in the same way that colleagues in the academic realm who've worked within sport and sociology or sport and politics have their own conceptual and heritage that means that sport diplomacy exists both with and in relation to these other realms. So when you're talking about the sport for development community, the sport legal community, these are all parts of the sort of architecture. And sport diplomacy has emerged to a part in my own work, but some others as well, Stuart Murray particularly. That means there is a identifiable field of study here, and not just for its own sake, but because it has a practical dimension. And I think what I've taken from my understanding of sport law is far less the sort of contractual dimension, which sometimes we think about as the multi-million-dollar media contract for Premier League rights or something like that. And clearly there's a contract there, but and again, I don't want us to speak out of turn, but a contract's a contract in some senses. It's much more the legal sort of governance that comes with that. It's the acceptance of expertise and relevant expertise, and understanding where a legal opinion is going to buttress your diplomatic argument. So understanding that it's not just about the the legal construct, particularly within a nation, because that varies from nation to nation, but understanding the different sense of governance and the ethical practices that underpin a contract that is being signed by parties perhaps across different national boundaries. But I think there's also something to take from my appreciation of sports law that applies even when contracts aren't in place. There are implications for this at much lower levels, and particularly without any financial repercussions. But I see good sports law practice being played out in some of the transactions around safeguarding and issues like that, which I've seen both in a sort of parliamentary case, but also at a much more local level. I've been undertaking some coaching qualifications myself, and I can sort of read into them the legal dimensions of this, which I think are a considerable boon. And again, sports law is not isolated in itself. It fits into a legal construct, and I think that's very much evident to me. So sports law provides a means for my understanding of sports diplomacy to fit into the broader legal framework of this country, of the European Union as we're still in it, and the broader sort of concept of international law, which is understood as that consensual feature. There's no, international law is a separate conversation, but at least in some sense it has little binding qualification, but it has a huge amount of influence. And I think that's where you can translate that very directly both into diplomatic practice and into the sporting realm, which is why sport and diplomacy comes together as an informed by, solid sports law practice.
Well, also for example, a conversation with some of our mutual friends, there is also this feeling that, often from a sports law perspective, that lawyers have been dealt with or have been dealing once the policy has been developed, right? Once the discussions, there's sometimes, and I'll say all too often, the lawyers are being brought in once the decision's been made, and they're saying, right, how can you implement this, or how can you do that, and then actually haven't been part of an earlier discussion, which means that whether it's on a contractual point, you can flag up a potential risky provision in a contract, or something that could be worded better, or something that's safely prohibited, or from a practice case or implications for a safeguarding, as an example, risk management, that they could be brought in the conversation much earlier. Would you say that that's something that you agree that that's a sort of a shared view from some of the people we'll be speaking to, that they would like the lawyers to be involved, not from a perspective of let's say implementation, but from an advisory point of view? And then that's that point where you were saying about people having understanding someone's position better is going to be advantageous if you're trying to be better at diplomacy?
I think there's, the understanding where to get good advice from and listening to people who have got a particular, skill set and experience is something that we should all be doing. I think, the conversations that those who, as it were, self-identify as sport lawyers can offer is something that should be almost in the sort of first, stages of any sort of conversation. I would like to see, local football clubs almost have, access to some legal advice. I'd like to see, the school sports sector have a greater understanding of not just the sort of, harder side and, frankly, some of the unpleasant things that, the law needs to deal with, but some of the advisory and thought processes that, lawyers have to go through, I think are really useful things for people in the sporting world. Preparation, understanding, as many as it's possible of the ramifications of your decision before you take them. These are good things that, as I understand it, and my one course in law that I took, lawyers have to do. So it's a valuable function of what we need to see as the output to, any process. And I think that sport for a long time hasn't sought advice from outside sport, and I think those sports lawyers who have tried to keep maybe a foot in each camp is something that we can really make a difference with. So I think there's a great degree of sense in seeking to have sports lawyers as part of the conversation elsewhere, other than where they might normally exist. But I think that requires some crucial diplomacy to make sure it happens sensitively and without necessarily huge cost, because many of these sports organizations are not going to be able to afford high fee levels, and there's a social function which I think all professions can offer, and I think the opportunity to have impact and the monitoring and evaluation of that in sport is something that the legal profession could offer to very good effect.
Well, of course, I would agree with you. More work for lawyers, great idea, totally. No, but joking aside, absolutely.
Pro bono.
You're going to be very popular in the sports law community now. You'll be quoted everywhere. Joking aside, I agree with you, though. I think that definitely at the different levels, there's opportunity there, and the knowledge sharing part is something obviously that's in the DNA of what we do. So I totally agree with you there. I guess my final point is, what do you think the discussions are going to be like going forward? Obviously, we talked about what you would like to happen. What do you think, like both ongoing with COVID at the moment and then post-COVID environment, what do you see, happening, particularly given that sport is, we haven't really touched on though, but sport from a government perspective is often about education, healthcare, societal impact around all these other issues, other than the sport is almost not quite secondary, but the competitive element of sport is not really the main thing. The physical activity and education and social elements seem to be weighted on much greater by governments. So how do you see all that sort of being impacted and influencing the government's perspective as much as, or governments, I should say, perspective as much as in these trying times?
I think there will be, some unfortunate tensions arise. The rescheduling events is going to be difficult. It's going to require a lot of common sense to get to that point where people have a common set of fixtures, guidance, etc. Making the most of the resources we have whenever fixtures are going to recommence, and whether that, and I think that's whether that's at a local level, of a my son's team again, or international competition. There's going to need to be some careful thinking. I think we can do that. We arrange fixture lists all the time, and
exactly,
you can do that. But I think there's I would take advantage of the solidarity in that. There will be some difficult competition, scenarios. Some people will lose significant amounts of money, and I don't just mean individuals, I mean, organizations. I think we should be, if it's recommending to government, I think there should be a sort of solidarity payment of some function, collectively amongst sport, for sport. I think we can look to, clubs who are going to find it particularly difficult to carry on, again, all levels, whether you're from the, elite sport or, local participatory sport. But I think perhaps the greatest, thing that I see moving forward is recognizing the social and community dimensions of sport in a way that is not just a million miles away from the commercial and high profile level of sport. I think the connections between those mega
Oh, I've just lost you for some reason. Can you hear me still?
mega bucks institutions
Sorry,
and the local is something that's going to come from this, because I think if you're a consumer of the record at this point, you'd also want to see local sport. There'd be if we could meet, I would come and watch your kids play football now because I need to see some football. I think if we that is something that we could that people will want to see. So I think there's an opportunity for enhancing the community dimension of sport, even if it means we can't simultaneously watch it all together in one stadium. But I think that's where there's real opportunity. And again, diplomacy has a long track record of bringing people together without them being physically together. So I think we have that opportunity in sport to have community experience, those shared memories that sport gives us, and is reason it has that social capital. But we will need to give some serious thought to how we do that moving forward.